It's time for another Friday update on Canadian housing and the economy. You didn't ask for it, I didn't ask for it, but it just keeps happening. I've got 3 stories for you today, and it's a classic all bad news update this week, which I know is everybody's favorite. But first, to start us off on a positive note, I've got a couple of channel updates. First, I got my very first piece of fan art. A viewer who goes by My Rainy Weekends painted these 2 fantastic portraits of my cats. I know I don't show them that often in videos, but they're the real brains behind the operation. Anyway, she also does commissions, and I think the expressions are captured really well, so if you want a great custom portrait of your pets, check out My Rainy Weekends. Also, friend of the channel and secret source Gina recently informed me that it's real estate industry award season. Anyway, I won this, and I have to say, Gina, I couldn't have done it without you. First up, Statistics Canada released the December inflation numbers this week. I was actually getting all geared up for a good news story this week because while market projections were expecting a rise in overall headline inflation, they were also expecting a drop in the core measures of inflation that the Bank of Canada uses to guide their policy decisions. The expectation was that core inflation would drop and give some credibility to the bank's assertion that they've raised rates enough. Instead, it turns out they're both up. Overall inflation rose to 3.4% as expected, but the core measure of CPI trim rose to 3.7% and CPI median stayed flat at 3.6% instead of dropping as anticipated. Overall, market expectations are still looking forward to cuts starting this year, but this could push the first rate cut out further, and if we continue to see inflation moving in the wrong direction in the coming months, there is a small possibility that we could see a hike rather than cuts. Next, the Canadian Real Estate Association has released the housing market stats for December. While sales rose month over month, the total sales for the year were down 11% from an already slow market in 2022, resulting in the lowest amount of sales since 2008. The home price index was down 0.8% month over month, but was up 0.7% year over year. However, keep in mind that inflation is 3.4%, so that's still a drop in real value. On top of that, as I've mentioned in previous videos, year over year stats can be misleading when we're seeing market trends on a shorter timescale. January 2023 was the low point for prices before a small rebound later in the year, but now we've fallen back to almost the previous low point from a year ago. If home prices continue to decline or even stay flat as the 12-month trailing price goes up, we'll start seeing year over year losses in the stats. If that happens, expect real estate headlines to start focusing on monthly or quarterly data instead, or looking at metrics like average sale price rather than the home price index. Most real estate groups seem to be anticipating a strong spring market on the expectation of rate cuts, so we'll see what happens in the coming months. However, I did see this interesting post by some guy who said that the rate being offered for new 5-year fixed mortgages is 2.7% above the average rate for existing mortgages, so we'll see what happens with renewals. Finally, National Bank Financial released a report saying that Canada has caught in a population trap for the first time in modern history. This is defined as a situation where population is increasing so fast that no increase in living standards is possible because all available savings are needed to maintain the existing ratio of capital to labor. Canada's population grew by over 1.2 million people in 2023, following an increase of 850,000 in 2022, which was already a record, as you can see on this perfectly normal-looking chart. Every single province grew at a rate of at least double the OECD average of 0.6%, with most provinces falling in the range of about 5 times the average rate. Meanwhile, our housing supply deficit reached a new record, with the lowest recorded number of housing starts relative to the growth in the working-age population. This has contributed to persistent inflation in shelter costs, with shelter inflation coming in at about double the rate of overall inflation. Also, as I mentioned back in the December 1st update, our real GDP per capita has been declining for over a year now. While we're not technically in a recession by the commonly accepted definition of 2 quarters of decline in overall GDP, more than 100% of our GDP growth has been coming from population growth over the past 5 quarters, with the exception of a teeny-tiny increase in per capita GDP in the first quarter of 2023. Our capital stock per person has fallen into negative growth, and unfortunately, it's not just a housing deficit. Even excluding housing, our capital stock per person has been in decline for years and is now down to where it was over a decade ago. Rounding out the report is a breakdown of where population growth came from. As I mentioned last month, net population growth was almost entirely international migration, with the bulk of that coming in the form of non-permanent residents on study or work permits, who are supposedly needed to address the labor shortage, which I don't believe is even a real thing, as I discussed in my myth of the labor shortage video. Overall, the report is pretty darn bad, but worth reading if you want some more details on these recent trends. Now, if you've watched this far and are still looking for more stuff to think about, I want to finish off this video by discussing a concept known as Goodharts Law, which is relevant to some of these issues. Named after economist Charles Goodhart, the way it's normally stated is that when a measure is used as a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Basically, the idea is that when you start making policy decisions to improve a particular stat, it's generally no longer a good indicator of performance. And this concept applies to all sorts of things, not just economics. One example from last year is when Manitoba planned to tie education funding to performance using metrics like graduation rates. This might seem to make sense at first because it would incentivize schools to improve their performance to get more students to graduate. The obvious problem, however, is that schools would have a financial incentive to make graduating easier and issue diplomas to people who might not have passed under normal circumstances. This is a big part of why the Bank of Canada bases their policy decisions on core inflation to achieve a target on overall inflation. This is also why, despite the assertions of many real estate influencers, it would be a bad idea to try to lower mortgage interest costs to get overall inflation back down to the target range. Obviously, mortgage interest is a major component of overall inflation, but if we drop rates to try to get back to the target, it would really just be manipulating the overall inflation number at the expense of basic needs like shelter, food, and electricity, which are still above the target inflation rate. Similarly, by targeting overall GDP growth as the key metric of our economy, politicians have steered us into our current population trap. Yes, our overall GDP may be growing, but the main beneficiaries are people who are already quite wealthy, while GDP per person is in decline. This is why it's important to look at a variety of different stats and information and try to figure out the overall story that's being told by the data. Ultimately, the real economy is not made up of numbers, it's made up of people, and if the people aren't doing well, you can't really say the economy is doing well either. Anyway, that's all for this week, so if you stuck it out for the whole video, thanks for watching and enjoy your weekend.